This video lesson is going to cover lathes in 3ds Max. And so what is a lathe? Well, first of all, a lathe is a machine, and what it does is it actually takes a block of wood or a block of metal, or even a cylinder for that matter, and spins it on its horizontal axis, and then you use cutting tools to basically chip into it. And so if you've ever been in a construction lab or done any woodworking, you'll understand what a lathe is. Now in 3ds Max, lathes are a lot simpler. You're still using the same concept as like a real lathe in a construction lab, but what you're doing is you're drawing out with lines and shapes a profile, and then what happens is that is then wrapped around a particular axis like this vase right over here. Now, lathe objects can be very numerous. You can do a wine glass or a goblet, you can do a vase, a lamp, a decorative item, a bell, and the list keeps going on and on and on. Check out these chess pieces with the lathes. This is a really good example over here. So you have half the profile, and then this is all a lathe object. You also have some very, very decorative type holders here. It might be a candle holder, or it might just be some sort of ornamental type decoration. So lathes themselves in 3ds Max are very, very easy to do. And so let's begin with that part. So one of the things I'd like to do is change your perspective, because anytime you're working with lines, you typically want to be working with lines in like a two-dimensional view rather than in a perspective. So let's go ahead to perspective and change. And in this time, instead of going top, we're going to actually go front. There we go. So now you can see all the different objects that we have as two-dimensional items. So from the plus tab, I'm going to go back right over here to my shapes, and I'm going to pick the line tool. Now what I'm going to do is do something relatively simple, and that simple, might be, say, like a wine glass or a vase. Maybe I'll just go with a wine glass instead of confusing things. All right, so let me just zoom in here, and I'm going to go ahead with my line tool, and so I'm going to start to do the stem. Okay, so hold down Shift to constrain, and then I'm going to click and drag. Okay, I'm going to go upwards now, and then I'm going to come across like this and click and drag, and click, hold down the Shift key. And then this particular line that I'm going to be drawing is the most important line, and it should be completely straight. And the reason why we want it to is because our axis is going to flow around this particular line right here. And let me click. Now, of course, I got to close off my loop, and I know it might not be perfect, but we can always fix that afterwards. And as always, say yes to closing the spline. Okay, so we can always tweak things a little bit. So let me go ahead and go right click. And if you recall, we can actually convert this into an editable spline and break this down so we can control the vertices or line segments. I always typically like to use the vertex. It's just a bit easier. So let me go ahead and just move this upwards here. And I'll nudge this up ever so slightly here. Okay, that looks pretty good for the most part. And I think our lathe is going to work quite well as far as a modifier goes. And I realize that this wine glass or goblet, for that matter, is very large, but we can always scale this down afterwards. Okay, so to our modifier list. And we're looking for lathe, so I'm just going to type in LA. And there it is. Now, when I first apply the lathe modifier, things kind of look a little bit weird. This is kind of not the profile that we went with. And so it's kind of a matter of basically playing with these settings right over here. And so what I'm going to do is under the align, I'm going to first click on max, and then there's my wine glass right there. And that works pretty good. Now, max works really good when I'm in the front view. Supposedly you're on the left or the bottom view or many different types of views, it might not work so good. Now I also have a bit of problems with geometry right over here. We're gonna have to fix this because not all lathe objects created in 3ds Max are perfect. Okay, so I think I'm happy with that for the most part. It did turn out pretty good. Now, if you do notice though, not only do I have a problem with kind of polygons not forming properly right over here, it is a wine glass, and what we should have with our wine glass is actually like an empty top here. So what I plan to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to break this down to an editable poly again, so we can actually work with the individual polygons. So let's go ahead and select the polygons from here. And then with my window selection, make sure I click on ignore back facing, because when I highlight this, I don't want to get extra stuff. Awesome. Now let's hit the delete key and get rid of that. All right, so we've already covered the lathe modifier, and that looks good. But you'll also notice with regards to this lathe here, there is a bit of an issue that the inside is kind of dark and it might not render so properly. We can always test that out. So it doesn't look too bad anyways, but you'll notice that it's just really, really thin. So we're gonna have to fix that. So let's just cancel that out. Now, one way to fix this is actually working with another modifier called the shell modifier, because this, glass wall is very, very thin, or goblet wall. So going back into my modifier list, introducing a new modifier, we're going to type in shell or SH, so it brings it up, and click on that. And now all of a sudden you can see that we have color inside of here, but we can also see that we have a thickness too. And that thickness can be controlled either on the inner amount here, whoops, or the outer amount. Just be careful though that you don't go crazy, because the polygons will fold on each other if you really crank that up. So that's, obviously something that you have to take into consideration. So those are two modifiers that we covered. Not all lathe objects need to be broken down to editable polys. Some of them will just work out naturally on their own. And as well too, you don't have to always delete polygons on top. It's depending on what you're making. I was just showing you a different way of doing things. So I encourage you to check out all the different lathe objects, incorporate them into your scene, whatever that might be, and find some sort of useful parts, such as a water fountain, or you might have a cool kind of lamp top. You can see this really cool pergola right over here with this really neat sort of top. With the extra detail in there, cool table, and the list goes on and on and on if you explore the different lathe objects. So hope that helps out. And so that's that video. And the next video we'll start to look at lofts, but I'm going to give you another video made by somebody else, so I don't have to make one.